Hi, welcome back. Today we're going to be looking at the concept of manifest destiny, closing out our Unit 4 with the goal of trying to put together so many of the various ideas that we've been discussing over the last couple of weeks. And today's topic is this idea of manifest destiny. Although this is a phrase that's not going to be coined until the mid-1840s, the idea that the American people were destined to spread across the continent and that there would one day be a nation that went from the Atlantic to the Pacific had been an idea that goes back even to before the founding of our nation, with the proclamation line of 1763 that prohibited our colonists after the French and Indian War of spreading west. That was something they disliked. They believed it was their right. And we will see that the history of the United States during the antebellum period continues with this idea that westward expansion is something that all Americans should do. Our picture here on our screen is just to give you a sense of the time period. We've been speaking a little bit about art and culture. This particular image is one in which we have two very different groups of people. You can see that the gentleman, the white people who are sitting on top of those steps, they've gotten some news, something that surprised them, something that's engaging them. They've actually just found out that war has been declared against Mexico in 1846. But we see some other people who are outside of this conversation and perhaps also have an interest even if they can't actively do anything. Our artist has very wisely put a lady here who might be indicative of that private sphere that women inhabited in the antebellum period. And obviously we see what is an enslaved man and child who are looking to these men who seem to be discussing the news of the day. And our artist is inviting us to have sympathy with them and consider that what these other people may see as the benefits or the negativities of going to war with Mexico and westward expansion will directly impact these two individuals, although they may have no power to directly affect the outcome of this event. Also, our author has attempted be a little heavy-handed with our symbolism. He has placed all of his characters on the front porch of something called the American Hotel. So when we talk about westward expansion, we have to also examine the issue of the day, which was slavery. As we spoke about in our last lesson, slavery is moving west. And we can see that in 1820, that there were real concerns politically and geographically about the spread of slavery. You have pro-slavery forces in the South, those who are deeply invested in the cotton economy. They want to guarantee that they can continue that agricultural production as far west as possible. So in 1820, realizing that we were soon to have, potentially, if Missouri entered the Union, more senators who were pro-slavery than were not pro-slavery, or at least represented free states, there was this concern that the only way to let Missouri into the Union is that there had to be some agreement, some check on this spread of slavery, but also for pro-slavery advocates, they wanted to make sure that there would not be, over time, too much of this free state power as well in Congress. And so that's how we get our 3630 line that runs across just the unorganized territory of the Louisiana Purchase. It goes no further because that's where the United States ends and Mexico begins. So it's not a very large area of land, but Missouri will enter the Union as a slave state, and to balance that, at this point, we will see Massachusetts essentially give up its northern claims to what will become known as Maine, which will enter as a free state. And at that point, we at least have within the United States Senate an equal number of senators who represent the free and the pro-slavery states. This is a very tentative truce, and in a sense, by passing this, there were individuals, Thomas Jefferson being one of them, he called it the fire bell sounding in the night. He believed that this actually was going to further sectionalism, not create a more nationalistic policy, that ultimately members of Congress were creating two distinct Americas for the future of the country. So, westward migration, we're going to have people going west and settling long before the United States actually has official claim to much of these lands. For most of the people who went out west, what they were doing was called squatting. They had no legal right to be where they were. They typically would take 4 stakes, put them to mark the corner boundary of their land. So whether that was a few hundred acres or maybe a few thousand acres, you have lots of people, basically from the time of Lewis and Clark onward, who are going to be going out west. And we mean really far west. We're finally talking about the west of the Pacific, not the west of Michigan. But the people who are going to go out and migrate there, we're going to see a huge uptick in that migration beginning around 1840. Once we have the establishments of larger settlements along the Mississippi River, places like Independence and St. Louis, people actually already settling in what will become the state of Iowa. We see from there, you will have people who will collect in the thousands to make these annual pilgrimages that hopefully will be a permanent resettlement for new land out in the West. This overland trek took anywhere from 5 to 6 months. Typically, people began it in the late spring to be finished somewhere around October, November. If you got caught in the Sierra Nevadas, even in late October, you might find yourself snowed in. The infamous Donner Party had that fate. The mortality rate was relatively high. For 1 out of every 10 people didn't make it. So if you've ever played any kind of game like Oregon Trail, you understand that things like dysentery, occasionally attacked by native people, although more likely you were going to die from things like cholera, or simply the elements, exposure, as the months grew colder and snow began to fall, if you were still traveling westward. Most of the people who are going to migrate in this 20-year period are going into what is today Oregon, Washington State, northern coastal California. And you can see on our map here, we have lots of routes. Most people travel these established trails because of safety. Also, over time, you had essentially a large enough path that had been trod into the earth to guide people. You will see that there are certain journeys that don't make it all the way west. So this pink line here, which is known as the Mormon Trail, the Mormons by 1844, their leader, Joseph Smith, is murdered in Missouri, and they believe that they truly have to separate themselves from what is American society that doesn't accept their religious beliefs and values. And their next leader, Brigham Young, will take what is left of those who are following Joseph Smith's words out to what is Salt Lake City today. But that was known as the Mormon Trail, and plenty of people followed it, but they didn't necessarily stay at Salt Lake. They'll continue on moving further north. And so what was known as the Oregon Trail actually started a little further west and south of where the Mormons typically began, and they will cross over that Mormon Trail, moving pretty far north up to what is the Columbia River today. We'll also see some people who are going to follow what were the established trails from long before there was a United States, what is known as the California Trail and the Santa Fe Trail. These have their origins in Spanish settlement going all the way back to the 1500s. And then obviously you can see that we have this blue line that indicates that there is some migration of people who are coming from Mexico itself. It's important to realize that as of 1848, all of the land that we now call the continental United States will belong to the U.S. But prior to 1848, much of the land that is west of the Great Plains is actually still going to belong to Spain, or like this Oregon territory is still going to have British claims. But this westward migration is going to bring about 300,000 people to the west long before we actually have states in that region. So the picture on my screen, this actually is a very large mural that exists in our nation's capital in Washington, D.C. But I think it does a really good job of showing us how Americans viewed westward expansion. And just looking at the symbolism here, you can see that we have lots of people who are convening. They've maybe taken a break over a long travel, and they're looking off into the distance. And our author, our artist has done something here very interesting in that they've put lots of light on the left side of the page. And so in a sense, our eye is following in that direction. We see our leader here pointing off into the west, and we can look at that part of the picture and realize that that's the hope. That is the manifest destiny. This is what God has laid before the American people. And on the right side, that's what people have passed through, left behind, and they're moving forward. But this course of empire, it was a deep held belief well into the early 20th century that the United States needed to continue to expand to it with land. Even after we developed the continental United States, we will go on and buy Alaska from Russia. We'll annex what will be the Hawaiian Islands and other lands in 1898. So this expansion of U.S. territory will continue well into the 20th century. So a couple of big questions that we want to make sure we can answer as we go through our lecture today. The first one is, how did the idea of westward expansion contribute to American national identity? So the idea we're looking at is that Americans for centuries, going back to the colonial period, saw that there was always promise and opportunity to move west. That was going to be perhaps how you built your fortune or how your children did. And so the idea of a United States that would stop at the Mississippi River was not part of that conception. The idea was that God had placed the land here, and it was for Americans to settle and to progress. Whether there were native people in the way or people from other places was rather irrelevant, because the idea was that for the fact that people could enter the land and establish a homestead there, that meant that God had intended it for them, essentially a self-fulfilling prophecy. So we want to take a little sidestep here and look at Texas. So Texas, hopefully you realize, is the largest state in our union by land and pretty close by population. Texas itself was its own country for 9 years, and prior to 1836 was one of the many states of Mexico. Texas as a landmass was ceded to Spain in 1819. The United States, with the Adam-Onis Treaty, made a decision that Florida was far more valuable than Texas at the time. We wanted to have a very large coastline and greater control for trade in the Gulf of Mexico. And so we exchanged any claim we might have on Texas for Florida, and the Spanish agreed that they would vacate any claims that they had tried to establish in what we will go on to call Oregon Territory. Within 2 years, Mexico has its own revolution from Spain and declares its own independence. And part of this declaration of independence will come a new constitution, and within a few years, Mexico will be different from the United States in that it will be a place that has abolition. There will be no slavery. Why does this matter? Well, as Mexico is an independent country, this area of Texas now belongs to them. But very few people who were Mexican actually lived there. They wanted to encourage settlement, immigration. And so Mexico will contract with various people, including a man named Stephen Austin, who has a city named after him today in Texas, to essentially colonize what is Texas today. The area that we would see that's more sort of Houston, Galveston area, eastern Texas, And they had to make a few agreements with Mexico. Mexico said that even if you were coming from a Protestant background, you were to become a member of the Catholic Church, and that you were to become Mexicanized, meaning that you were to agree to the policies of Mexico and essentially be willing to become a Mexican citizen over time. None of these things were ever enforced, which then created problems. Over the course of 13 years, Stephen Austin alone will bring more than 15,000 settlers to what is Texas today. And in doing so, he is bringing people who are already invested in cotton production and own slaves. And this is where we're going to have the problem with Mexico, because the kinds of people who want to come and settle in Texas are people who own slaves. They're coming to raise cotton. That's their only reason for coming to Texas at that time. So when Mexico officially outlawed slavery in 1830, there is a lot of conflict because the people who've come to colonize from the United States are slave owners, and they refuse to comply with this change in the law. So over the course of 6 years, we will see that those Americans who have settled, who have colonized in Texas, are unwilling to change. And eventually, the Mexican army will attempt to intervene. They want to stop any kind of armed rebellion on the part of these U.S. citizens who have come and colonized and settled in Texas. And in the very beginning, the Mexican army is able to put down the part of the rebellion that begins in Stephen Austin's corner of Texas, but over time is unable to maintain that control. And the people who are going to be involved in this issue, you're going to see people who were settlers who had done much of the land claims west of the Appalachian Mountains after the American Revolution, including people like Davy Crockett. And Davy Crockett actually wanted to sell Texas because he was somebody who had had concerns about how the United States government had handled Indian removal. He had stood against it, and in a sense kind of wanted to get away from what was the United States proper, and thought he was going to get another opportunity to do that in Texas. Sam Houston, again, another person who has a city named after him in Texas, will go on to become essentially the leader of these white United States forces that create this rebellion in Texas, and actually go on to capture the military leader of Mexico, General Antonio Santa Anna. And by 1836, this rebellion essentially becomes a ceasefire. With General Santa Anna's capture and the loss of most of his forces, there is a settlement. The Mexican army pulls back south of what is the Rio Grande, which is the southern boundary of Texas today. And these settlers in Texas decide that they now are the Republic of Texas, the Lone Star Republic. They elect Sam Houston to be their first president. Why did they form their own country? Well, that had not been their original intention. They thought they could have this rebellion, win it, push out any kind of Mexican military presence, and that the United States Congress would just simply accept them into the Union. For 9 years, Congress refuses to do this. So the question is, why would Congress not want to annex Texas? Well, there's probably lots of reasons, but the first one is going back to what had been the Missouri Compromise of 1820. Missouri coming in as a slave state had been highly contentious until people like Henry Clay could come up with this compromise that you would have a free state also enter the Union, that you would draw this line that would create a geographic boundary about slave and free in the Louisiana Purchase, that you would not have any kind of peace on this subject. And for many people sitting in Congress, they just didn't want to open up this issue again. Certainly, pro-slavery advocates were far more likely to want to annex Texas than those who were involved in the abolition, or simply just didn't want to see slavery spread any further west. So we've spoken a little bit about foreign policy in Unit 4, and we're going to kind of return to that. We don't think about it, I think, today when we think foreign policy, we're thinking about China, we're thinking about our relations with Europe, the Middle East. But foreign policy for us is going to be about nations that have land claims in what we consider now the continental United States. In 1840, we have this election of Tippecanoe and Tyler II. Tippecanoe, aka William Henry Harrison, we know dies in office just after the first month of being inaugurated, and his vice president, John Tyler, takes over. And Tyler inherits these problems that go all the way back to Jackson's time. And the first one is what to do with this northern land. Since 1819, there's been no Spanish influence in this area of Oregon country, but there certainly is British influence. What is Vancouver Island today? That northern section of the United States was an area that was very contentious. There was no official boundary, northern boundary at least, between the United States and what land that Great Britain claimed. The only real significant boundary was that which was created by the Great Lakes. So by 1846, and it'll be under James K. Polk that we'll see a finalization of this, but there eventually will be a treaty that establishes what is today's current northern boundary, which is the 49th parallel. Although there were people who said we should go much farther north, there was discussion of 54-40 or fight, which would be this upper portion, this green portion, if you will, essentially going almost to what is southern Alaska today. That cooler heads will prevail, but we will get an Oregon treaty that ultimately gives us the land as Washington State and Oregon today. We will also see that the northern boundary on the eastern side, where Maine, Vermont, New Hampshire all meet Canada today, will also be settled by something called the Webster-Ashburton Treaty. But this whole issue of Texas is another foreign policy dilemma, but now it's with Mexico. President Tyler, like his predecessors, doesn't really want to have to deal with it. But over the course of 1844, there is yet another presidential election, which Tyler loses to a man named James K. Polk. And realizing that Polk runs on a platform of manifest destiny, actually one of the people who championed his campaign, will use that phrase, and it will become one that Americans overwhelmingly will accept as their mantra. We're going to go west. And so Congress decides that it's now received to a point that we're not just simply talking about Texas, we're talking about Oregon country and potentially other lands west of the Louisiana Purchase. So Polk calls a joint session of Congress in 1845. And at that point, there is a decision made, and there is a majority of both houses of Congress at that time agree that Texas can enter the Union as the 28th state. So James K. Polk is an interesting figure. He, like Andrew Jackson, is from this area of North Carolina, but only from his childhood. By his early adult years, he will have moved on to Tennessee. But he was someone who came from pretty humble means, wasn't born in a log cabin, actually a wooden structure that still sits in Pineville, North Carolina today. But James K. Polk is a man who had a lot of experience with different roles. He had been a Secretary of State. He had been a member of the United States Senate. He was someone who was championing this idea of empire and liberty, that the American empire was going to stretch from ocean to ocean. And by having more land available, that was going to extend the greater amount of freedom and liberty to people. So manifest destiny, again, we spoke about this at the beginning of our lecture, but this idea that God has destined the American people to spread their democratic spirit across the continent. Again, this is an old idea, but the phrase itself, manifest destiny, is coined in 1844 by a newspaper reporter and fan of Polk called John L. O'Sullivan. Polk's followers are going to not only embrace this idea, but again, are going to be people who think maybe we should be taking land further north, including bits of Canada. And so part of the campaign slogan that Polk will have will also be 54-40 or fight. This idea that we might even be willing to go to war once again to claim a little bit more land in Canada. We don't, but just to give you a sense of how people rationalize expansion west in the mid-1840s. But Polk was very open about California also becoming part of the United States, and California was yet another state of Mexico. And you can see this map here. Today, much of this in the north, so what is Tejas, Nueva Mexico, and a good portion of California actually belongs to the United States today, and that will be a result of war starting in 1846. But to openly speak about claiming land like California, Polk was ultimately putting forward an agenda and certainly intimating that the United States was not only looking to continue pushing west, but was willing to take some action with another nation to get what it wanted. So the United States will go to war with Mexico over the course of 2 years, between 1846 and 1848. But before war happens, Polk will actually attempt to make an overture to Mexico. He will have a special envoy, John Slidell, who will propose to the Mexican president a purchase of $25 million to buy California, which essentially was California today, parts of Arizona, Nevada. Mexico refuses. James K. Polk feels that there has been movement of Mexican forces into that area, and there were some who were actually in fortification stationed in that portion of the country. He sends his own representative and his own forces, led by a man named General Zachary Taylor, and they are put on the border of the Rio Grande. And this Rio Grande border is actually a border that Mexico does not recognize. They believed that what should be, if there is a southern border between the state of Texas and what is the nation of Mexico, it would actually end here, what we call the Nueces River. But there was plenty of settlement further west of that. So Zachary Taylor's forces are on one side of the Rio Grande. There are Mexican forces to the south. And over the course of 5 months, tensions continued to build. And by May of 1846, Zachary Taylor claims that his men have come under attack by Mexican forces and asks what he should do. How should he proceed? Polk asks Congress to declare war because Mexico has attacked U.S. troops who are currently not in Mexico. Most members of Congress will agree with the sentiment that if U.S. forces have been attacked by Mexico, we should go to war. But there were some people who will say, no, that one perhaps is not necessary, and two, might not actually be real. A young Abraham Lincoln is going to make note of what he calls a spot resolution, that he would be willing to agree to declare war on behalf of his state, Illinois. He just needs to know the spot where blood was shed. He never gets an answer to that, and he votes negatively about going to war. And as a result, in the next election, will actually lose his House of Representatives seat. But we do see that there are a few people who are concerned, not just simply with going to war with Mexico, but if we go and we win, which in all likelihood we will. We have a much larger army. We have people who are well established in the area willing to fight for that land. Mexico would have to continue defending land that they found difficult to occupy even in peacetime. So there are those like David Wilmot, who actually was a Democrat, but believes that the only way that we can legitimize a conflict with Mexico is if we agree that any land that is acquired through victory, no slavery will go there. So throughout the 1850s, people will speak about a landmass called the Mexican Cession. That will be the land that the United States will win when we're victorious over Mexico in the Mexican-American War. But going all the way back to 1846, there are individuals who can see on the horizon, just like we have in the past, every time we acquire more land, we open ourselves up to the slavery debate. David Wilmot wants to just take that slavery issue off the table. It's a proviso, so that's a big hint there. This never becomes law. The pro-slavery advocates and those who believed that they might not be reelected to Congress if they agreed to any such thing, there will be no movement on this issue. So it'll pass the House of Representatives, but the United States Senate will have enough pro-slavery advocates that it won't go any further than that. So the Mexican-American War, did it contribute more to nationalism or more to sectionalism? Well, on the face of it, at least at the start of the war, there is this idea for people who are not really considering the slavery issue that potentially we're going to add more and more land to the United States. And in that sense, it's for most people a nationally supported endeavor. But if we look a little deeper and we look at the long-term consequences of this war, ultimately we're going to see that this is going to be the greatest contributor to sectionalism because it's tied to this slavery issue. Again, just to give you a sense of when we look at the United States, its history in terms of acquiring land. From 13 states, we had the Northwest Territory, that is land that was unclaimed before we signed the Treaty of Paris in 1783. We have the Louisiana Purchase in 1803, and literally we continue to acquire more land, and each time we do, that territory now is going to begin a process of eventually being organized. And as it becomes organized, there's settlement. When there's 60,000 people, well, then we have these territories applying for statehood. And as we can see, certainly from 1820 on, that application of statehood is always going to come back to the issue of slavery. So will there be a war to annex Mexico? Absolutely. In May of 1846, Congress will declare war for the second time in history. Again, an overwhelming majority of the Senate and an overwhelming majority of the House of Representatives, regardless of whether you represent a free or a slave state. We will see that there will be multiple fronts to this war. So there's a man named John C. Fremont who actually was a member of the United States Army, but had spent most of his career out west doing exploration and map making. He will be in the California area along with a man named Stephen Kearny. And they will establish California pretty early on. They'll call it the Bear Flag Republic. So if you've ever wondered why the state flag of California looks the way it does, that's because that's what John C. Fremont, who was an interesting figure, decided to call it. Stephen Kearny will continue spreading further south. Ultimately, what will become New Mexico and Arizona will be the land that he will be instrumental in capturing during the course of the war. The U.S. will bring troops down to the Rio Grande, and they will continue to fight to the outskirts of Mexico City, where there will become a standoff. Over the next 6 months, U.S. troops will make a journey out of New Orleans and come to the eastern coast of California and make an overland trek to then attack Mexico City from its eastern flank and successfully capture it. And that will force Mexico's hand. In order to have control of their capital city again, they are going to have to settle with the United States, and they do with the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo in 1848. And you can see on our map here, all of this land that is in this cream color, this becomes the Mexican cession. The United States does pay money for it, but only $15 million. So think about James K. Polk had offered $25 million for basically what is California, Arizona, and Nevada. And through a little less than 2 years of war, we will get twice as much land for considerably less money. So where we want to end with our lesson today, again, this is sort of a mental exercise, but for you to think about to what extent did capitalist incentive and geographic expansion contribute to the rise of sectionalism between 1790 and 1850. That is one of our major themes of Unit 4. And so we need to break that down a little further. We're going to go back to the very beginning of our unit and say, okay, how did the Industrial Revolution reinforce a Southern commitment to slavery? How was American society transformed in both the North and the South by this economic issue? How did Western expansion fuel this sectional divide? Again, we have to look at two parts. This market revolution that's taking place in the northern portions of the United States, the building of this infrastructure that connects the North and the West, and then the southern facet of this economic expansion that comes through the large production of cotton in this time period, and therefore the ever increase and spreading west of slavery.